Hello, LeftTube, and welcome to my TED Talk. Stephen, the world is getting better Pinker, presents himself as a benign, evidence-driven, apolitical, public intellectual.
So I have an eclectic mix, which I examine on an issue-by-issue basis and evaluate in terms of my best reading of the evidence. I try not to fall into an ideology on the right or the left.
He is a Canadian-American cognitive psychologist, linguist, popular science author, and professor of psychology at Harvard. You'll find him featured in TED Talks, at fancy lecture halls, radio documentaries, and podcast interviews, telling the world's elites exactly what they want to hear, and making a career of it. His most recent effort, Enlightenment Now, is a manual for liberal self-congratulation. The book champions globalization and capitalism as the natural outgrowth of liberal Enlightenment values.
And it's just obvious that capitalism makes people richer and freer and better off in pretty much every way.
Specifically, he argues that the West's advancement of reason, science, and humanism have driven progress over the last couple centuries since the Enlightenment. To back up this claim, Pinker cites historical data on the 15 dimensions of well-being, showing that health, prosperity, safety, literacy, peace, and happiness have all tended to rise worldwide. What he's selling is a kind of comfort history, written by a psychologist, not a historian or economist. Nevertheless, the main point that Pinker wants to get across is that enlightenment equals liberalism equals good, and that everything good we have today came out of the Enlightenment, and that the haters should be much more grateful for all the progress the Enlightenment has brought us. Well, hang on just a minute. What about all this unsustainable wealth inequality I keep hearing all the poor people fuss about? Should we well-bred be concerned? Pinker has an answer, and it is a resounding no. Economic inequality is not itself a dimension of well-being. So what we have here in Enlightenment Now is every white upper-middle-class professional's wet dream. A science-backed, cool-headed, moral justification of privilege, optimism, and the status quo.
You argue that, quote, none of us are as happy as we ought to be, given how amazing our world has become. Amazing how? Amazing why?
Well, any aspect of human well-being that you measure has shown an increase. We live longer, more of us go to school, life is safer, fewer of us die in wars. And the point of the book is not just to document the progress, that's the middle section of the book, and I try to do it in 75 graphs, knowing that people will be incredulous.
There's a lot of data in the book.
They just won't believe it unless they see the graph showing poverty declining, showing deaths in war going down. But also to explain why it happened. I attribute it to a certain set of ideas that were expressed in the second half of the 18th century, the era that we call the Enlightenment, and I identify them as reason. We should try to analyze our situation logically and rationally instead of falling back on tradition and dogma and authority. If we apply reason and science to making people better off, we can gradually succeed. And then I argue that, in fact, we have succeeded.
And it all sounds very nice, but is it true? Is capitalism really the engine driving progress and spreading Enlightenment values? Was the Enlightenment really as tolerant and liberal as he claims? Is liberalism as liberal as liberals claim? Is poverty actually decreasing? Is growing wealth inequality really a non-issue? Why did the book go over like a lead balloon with virtually every scholar in English, philosophy, and history who studies the period? And more importantly, does Pinker's work really reflect that of a Spock-like, disinterested, objective social scientist in search of truth? Or is he selecting a patchwork of evidence to fit a muddled and ahistorical comic book narrative of technocratic progress? To answer this question, this video will focus on the three key pillars that make up the foundation of Pinker's ideological house of cards: poverty, capitalism, and inequality. And by the end of this 8-hour journey, you will come to know that Steven Pinker is a stupid idiot.
Stupid idiot! Stupid idiot! Stupid idiot! Stupid idiot! Stupid idiot! Stupid idiot! Stupid idiot!
The first plot hole in this children's story is the claim that there's been a reduction in global poverty.
200 years ago, 90% of the world's population subsisted in extreme poverty. Today, fewer than 10% of people do.
Not only is Pinker's assessment wrong, which we'll get to in a minute, the cultivated exterior of enlightened rationality obscures the political nature of Stinker's thesis. Don't let his big brain centrism fool you, comrades. There's an agenda here. His claim is that the spread of free market capitalism is responsible for this global reduction in poverty. This is a political statement, and a testable one. Roll clip.
Well, let's take global poverty.
Yeah.
You have a chapter in the book on prosperity. You want to make the case that the world is more prosperous and less poor than ever before, and you point to data showing the number of people living on the extreme poverty line, as defined by the World Bank today at $1.90 a day, is down from 2 billion in 1990 to 700 million in 2015. The world is becoming middle class, you say. But surely you know, I know you know, because you're a very clever, well-qualified guy, that there are numerous studies and a number of scholars who dispute that poverty measure as arbitrary, as inaccurate, that in reality, to quote from a recent academic paper by an anthropologist at the LSE, quote, around 4 billion people remain in poverty today, around 2 billion remain hungry, more than ever before in history.
That completely irrelevant to which way the numbers have gone. Of course, the definition of extreme poverty is going to be arbitrary. If you make it higher, then more people will be in poverty. If you make it lower, fewer people.
Exactly.
But no matter what cutoff you set, the direction is downward.
That's not true. That's
yes,
not,
it is.
If you look at the work done by Jason Hickel at the LSE, if you take a poverty line of $5, 1 billion people have been added to the number of people on that poverty measure since 1981. The trend shows the exact opposite when you move it to $5 a day.
In terms of the proportion of people in poverty by that criterion?
No, the sheer number of people.
Yes,
1 billion people have been added to the poverty total since 1981.
Yes, but billions of people have been added to the world as a whole. What's relevant is the proportion.
But you also use absolute numbers in your book. You say it's gone down from 2 billion to 700 million.
Well, I note that by at least the most widely accepted definition of extreme poverty, it's interesting that the absolute numbers have declined as well. But the main point is the proportion, because more people have been added, so anything is going to increase.
You say widely accepted, but this is my point. You don't acknowledge in the book, there's no caveats where you say, for example, Professor Lant Pritchett, Harvard colleague of yours, a development economist who studies this stuff, says the poverty line shouldn't be $1.90, it should be $12, $15 a day. And when you make that simple statistical change, the entire picture of poverty changes, and the arguments in your book basically fall apart.
As the aforementioned anthropologist and author Jason Hickel explains in greater detail, Pinker's numbers don't add up. For Pinker's book to make any kind of sense, a reduction in global poverty is one of the crucial indicators of progress that must be demonstrated. The main way he supports this claim is in using the World Bank's definition of extreme poverty as earning under $1.90 a day in US dollars. Not only is this official demarcation completely arbitrary, but the rate at which it fluctuates belies a more political motivation.
Poverty worldwide has not been decreasing, and in fact, evidence shows that it's been actually increasing. So let's take a closer look. First of all, the definition of poverty has been changed in a way that serves this poverty reduction narrative. The threshold of poverty, which is the poverty line, is normally calculated by each nation for itself, and it's supposed to represent what an adult needs to get by in every respective nation. In 1990, Martin Ravellian, an Australian economist at the World Bank, noticed that the poverty lines of a group of the world's poorest countries clustered around $1 per day. On Ravellian's recommendation, the World Bank adopted this as the first ever international poverty line. Using this threshold, the World Bank announced in its annual report in the year 2000 that the absolute number of those living on $1 per day or less continues to increase. The worldwide total rose from 1.2 billion in 1987 to 1.5 billion today, and if recent trends persist, will reach 1.9 billion by 2015. Just as soon as this horrific news came out, they flip-flopped on their position and said this: while poverty has been increasing steadily for some 2 centuries, the introduction of free market policies has actually reduced the number of impoverished people by 400 million between 1981 and 2001. Wow, how ideologically convenient. This news story was possible because the bank shifted the international poverty line from its original $1.02 at 1985 purchasing power parity to $1.08 at 1993 PPP, which, given inflation, was lower in real terms. With this tiny change, this flick of someone's wrist, the world was magically better and millions rose out of poverty. The international poverty line changed again in 2008 to $1.25, and the world again magically improved overnight. The $1.08 international poverty line made it look like the poverty headcount had been reduced by 316 million people from 1990 to 2005. But the new international poverty line, even lower than the last in real terms because of inflation, increased this number to 437 million people, creating the illusion that an additional 121 million people have been saved from poverty. The biggest problem with all this is that The $1-a-day international poverty line is based on the national poverty lines of the 15 poorest countries in the world. These lines give a very poor foundation since many are set by bureaucrats with very little data, and more importantly, they tell us nothing about what poverty is like in wealthier countries. According to Peter Edwards of Newcastle University, if people are to achieve a normal life expectancy, they need double the current IPL, or a minimum of $2.50 per day. But if this higher standard would be adopted, it would seriously make the World Bank look bad. If we were to use it, then the poverty headcount rises above 3.1 billion, almost triple what the World Bank claims. It also shows that poverty is getting worse, not better, with nearly 353 million more people impoverished today than in 1981. With China taken out of this equation totally, the number shoots up from 353 million to 852 million.
Even the World Bank has repeatedly stated that the line is too low to be used for any but the poorest countries, and should not be used to inform policy. Indignant, Pinker fights back. The drastic decline in extreme poverty is corroborated by measures of well-being other than income that are correlated with prosperity, such as longevity, child mortality, maternal mortality, literacy, basic education, undernourishment, consumption, etc. See what he did there? He's deflecting. He knows he can't make the poverty stats work, so he falls back on other indicators that have done much better.
You can't make an argument about poverty by pointing to something else entirely. A higher life expectancy among the poor is no justification for condemning them to a tiny and ever-shrinking share of global income.
Alternatively, Pinker and others like to point to increased access to cheap consumer goods as proof of poverty reduction.
The image we have of poor people as starving and living in squalor really is not accurate. Many of them have things. What they lack is the richness of spirit.
The poor used to be called the have-nots. In 2011, more than 95% of American households under the poverty line had electricity, running water, flushing toilets, a refrigerator, a stove, and color TV.
When you think of poverty, you picture this. But what if I told you it really looks like this? A new report showing poor families in the United States are not what they used to be. Now, many poor families have homes with cable TVs, cell phones, computers, you name it, much, much more. 99% of them have a refrigerator. 81% have a microwave. 78% have air conditioning. 63% have cable TV. 54% have cell phones. 48% have a coffee maker. Very interesting. Robert Rector, Heritage Foundation.
Well, that's curious. Liberal Pinker is making the exact same arguments as right-wing think tanks. We'll get to that later. Did you know that only a scant 150 years ago, neither the Vanderbilts nor the Rothschilds had any of these items? I did. And on page 117, for some reason, Pinker takes pains to make sure we know this fact. We take it in, absorb it. All right, Pinker, you got me. I tap out. The Rothschilds did not have microwaves. All they could do was get their servants to cook their food for them. What a tragic existence.
Progress.
Past bad, present good. Got it, Pinker. Going from living in squalor with no electricity or plumbing to living in squalor with a cell phone, television, Cheetos, and your choice of 17 different brands of toothpaste, but still no plumbing, might be nicer, but it's still poverty. It's still squalor. Speaking of Cheetos, citing the perks of globalization, Pinker boasts that today the poor are as likely to be as overweight as their employers. Now there's a hot take. Obesity is good, actually. What he's referring to, of course, is the abundance of cheap calories. As a nutritionist, the problem is all this ultra-processed food comes at the cost of essential micronutrients, which is why today a whopping 85% of Americans are technically malnourished.
Progress.
But the falling price of necessities is a red herring.
Consumption is increasing, yes, but that's not what's at stake here. What's at stake is whether or not consumption is increasing enough to raise people out of poverty.
It's not. This is all to say that the material conditions of the poor have not meaningfully changed. Today, according to the UN, 1.5 billion people are food insecure and do not have enough calories to sustain normal human activity, and a total of 2.1 billion suffer from malnutrition. French economist Thomas Piketty, that's hard to say, whose seminal work, Capital in the 21st Century, compiled the largest collection of historical economic data ever undertaken completely upends the notion that we've made considerable advances in poverty. The book is like 700 pages, so I'll save you the trouble of reading it by just offering a single quote from the author.
The poorer half of the population are as poor today as they were in the past, with barely 5% of total wealth in 2010, just as in 1910.
That's gonna be a big yikes for me, dog. Alright, so if we can all agree $1.90 a day is insufficient, what's a better measure of poverty? According to the New Economics Foundation, if we want to make a meaningful dent in infant mortality, around $8 a day is what's needed. Using this standard, some 5.1 billion humans would count as impoverished as of 2014. That's 80% of the world's population, and it's only gotten worse since then. Lant Pritchett and Charles Kenny of the Center for Global Development have argued that since the global poverty line is based on purchasing power in the US, then naturally it should be linked to the US poverty line, so around $15 a day. That standard would rocket global poverty stats well up into the 90s in percentage points. But even if we leave all these relative and absolute numbers aside,
what matters is the extent of global poverty vis-a-vis our capacity to end it. Only 5% of new income from global growth goes to the poorest 60% of humanity, people living on less than $7.40 a day.
You see this graph here? This is a measure of global poverty in relation to our capacity to end it.
In 1990, it would have cost 10.5% of world GDP to lift everyone above the poverty line. In 2013, it would have cost only 3.3%. Our capacity to end poverty has improved by a factor of 3.18. Meanwhile, the poverty rate has improved by only a factor of 1.23. This means that the moral egregiousness of poverty is 2.58 times worse than it was in 1990. Morally, we have regressed as a civilization.
Poverty is getting exponentially cheaper to solve by the minute, yet we've made virtually no progress in the past half century. I wonder what could be getting in the way. Capitalism. How does it work? Mr. Stinker holds up free market welfare state capitalism as the self-evidently most rational economic model for society, one that emerged naturally out of Enlightenment principles. But right off the bat, we run into a bit of a snag. He struggles with the basic political economy terminology. A free market can coexist with regulations on safety, environment, and labor, just as a free country can coexist with criminal laws. And a free market can coexist with high levels of spending on health, education, and welfare. Well, no, it can't. By definition, regulation, state ownership, and social programs negate the free in free market. On one hand, what he claims to advocate is better described as welfare state, embedded liberalism, or mixed economy, yet when you read the book, he spends the bulk of his effort extolling the virtues of free market globalization and the neoliberal consensus.
That don't make no sense!
Globalization, development analysts agree, has been a bonanza for the poor. Quoting from economist Angus Deaton, Pinker asserts that some argue that globalization is a neoliberal conspiracy designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many. It is. If so, that conspiracy was a disastrous failure. We already talked about this, Pinker, and the only failure was poverty reduction. Remember? So we have a contradiction here that I'm not sure Pinker fully understands. So he pays lip service to the welfare state, because all the evidence shows that's what works best. Yet at the same time, he's speaking the language of Clinton-Blair third-way neoliberalism, market fetishization, with a few bare-bones social entitlement programs sprinkled in to keep the liberals happy, feeling like they're good people. But whatever the flavor, Pinker nevertheless asserts that capitalism just works. Somehow.
There are certain phenomena in social life, like market economies, where the intelligence is distributed across millions of people. No one actually knows how to make the system work, but people make things, look for buyers, they set the price where people will buy them, and then over the entire society, things kind of work out. But no single individual has the theory as to how that ought to work.
Except for Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, and literally every charlatan who's ever opened capital. And if we really want to understand where we are now, we have to look at how we got here. So join me, won't you, on a journey to a place where no Pinker has ever gone before. This is a brief history of capitalism. After some 10,000 years juggling a mixed bag of socioeconomic systems, by the early 19th century, capitalism had emerged as the new transformational economic powerhouse. One of the key preconditions for the formation of capital relations was the expropriation of common land for private use.
The history of capitalism in its imperialist phase, its heroic period, is the history of expropriation. It is the history of the robbery of private property from millions and millions of people. Marx, observing this process in the Communist Manifesto, remarks on the tremendous advances in productivity and technique and innovation that were thereby enabled, but he does point to the fact that many, many people who hitherto had owned land, property, and so on were expropriated, collectivized, and made into the modern proletariat.
An entirely new class, without which the social relations necessary for the capitalist mode of production would have remained unfulfilled. This upheaval prompted an unprecedented mass migration from rural to urban centers over the course of a couple centuries. Étape 2. Appropriate and exploit the fruits of Enlightenment science, rationalism, and technology in order to power a second wave of colonial conquest.
The period 1820 to circa 1950 was one of violent dispossession across much of the global south. If you've read any colonial history, you will know that colonizers had immense difficulty getting people to work in their mines and plantations. As it turns out, people tended to prefer their subsistence lifestyles, and wages were not high enough to induce them to leave. Colonizers had to coerce people into the labor market, imposing taxes, enclosing commons, and constraining access to food, or just outright forcing people off of their land.
The cost of opening global markets to Western capital was paid in the form of some 40 million deaths in the Congo, India, and China alone.
Its evolution ab initio was based on the robbery of other countries' wealth and productivity. Let me again remind you of what Marx said about India. A tremendous expropriation by British imperialism of the resources of capital accumulation from India. An enormous input to the British Industrial Revolution, still the heartland of the evolution of capitalism, but a fantastic desolation of private property in India.
Étape 3. As expansion slows and industrialization matures, relentlessly improve technology using publicly funded research and development in order to lower production costs and devalue labor, thus ensuring a permanent and flexible underclass from which to extract profit and fuel consumption.
Don't let anybody suggest to you for an instant that capitalism does not regard people as means. Probably more than any other system in history, it has made a virtue of that ability, of the ability to conscript, to expropriate, and to dispossess in order to become an engine of wealth.
Provide said underclass with just barely enough education and money to enter the workforce and reproduce the increasingly complex system. To maintain conditions favorable to capital, expand the role and size of the state as required. Étape 4. Be galaxy brain centrist. Ignore inconvenient data, contradictions, and bloody history. Employ arbitrary yet convenient definitions of poverty and progress. Then declare, history solved. So now that we've demystified the roots of capitalism for Pinker, before we go on to talk about the ways in which it affects our lives today, let's go ahead and disabuse him of the myth of liberalism's origin story.
Free your mind!
Pinker believes that it was the Enlightenment ideas that drove the economic advancement that made progress possible. Interesting thought, but maybe he should have consulted with some of his heroes first.
One may contrast Pinker's belief in the Enlightenment with Adam Smith's claim that economic advance was kicked off by the discovery of the Americas and the rise of a global economy. Smith thought his own economic analysis was more a reflection of progress than a cause of it.
If the writings of liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill are any indication, the violence of colonialism was baked into liberalism from the very start.
He bases his whole understanding of liberty on Hobbes's conception of natural right, as do all liberals. So Hobbes maybe being this guy that is like, I want an absolute tyranny. I want a monarchy to stop the state of nature where humans are just like monsters killing each other because their liberty is wild, right? This idea that humans as these liberal, individuals with this, ability to do whatever they want, is their desire is going to get in the way of other people's desire, and it's all these individuals running around with pointed sticks stabbing each other at some unknown point in history. right? This is Hobbes' view, and so that's why he thinks there should be a monarchy. But all liberals accept that this is an essential view of human nature, that we're naturally like this, that we just want, and we are individuals, and we have this natural right of just having this liberty, right? So Mill says that this is, correct, and even in On Liberty he talks about, oh yeah, this is a correct view, but he says that the solution is no longer monarchy or the absolute tyranny, but a liberal republic. And he says that when humanity was in its infancy, the excess of liberty, which he meant the state of nature, where people were just running around and killing each other, warranted Hobbes' solution, which was some form of tyranny. But then he's like, humanity has grown up. This whole idea, everyone always complains that Marxists have this idea of like this view of that of progressive growing up or something, that we're like that kind of view of but it's a view of human nature it's actually liberals have this view too.
Yeah, exactly.
Much more so, they're the ones that actually have it. He's like, humanity has grown up, and so it is mature enough to function in a liberal republic, right? So then it can have this liberal republic with the harm principle functioning, but so this is the story he tells. But it's also worth noting in other texts that Mill was a defender of colonialism and all the ravages of British Empire, and he was an outright racist, right? And which is his stuff on empire is the stuff they don't let you read in your undergrad courses. They just want to read on liberty. He's exactly. For free speech and stuff. But he was he held that colonial conquest and was a good thing because he thought that Africans, Asians, and indigenous Americans were like humans in their state of infancy, right? And so he had this that whole story he tells about how humans living in the past needed tyranny. That was the past only for Europeans. It was the present in his view for anyone that wasn't European. Right. And so he had this idea, that racist view that everyone, all these other civilizations are uncivilized, right? And so he believed that since they were in a state of infancy, then they required the conquest of more civilized states like the Europeans to civilize them through tyranny in order that they too could be brought up to the level of, being able to live in a liberal republic. Right. So, behind all of that, so I told that ideological story kind of to show that behind this, there's a very real story of the tyrannical imposition of bourgeois social relations. Right. Behind all this, you have Mill thinking about colonialism and conquest, and it just reminds us too that this kind of liberal republic that he talks about. What does he mean by us growing up? How did that happen, right? Like, how did it get brought into being? And we know that the first versions of capitalism were quite tyrannical to begin with and violent, right? And we know that the capitalist liberal society eventually emerges after capitalism was violently imposed through what Marx called so-called primitive accumulation, right? And he talks about that. There's that passage in his in Capital, the section on so-called primitive accumulation, where he talks about workers being violently torn from the land, and how the pedestal in Britain and Western Europe required slavery and colonialism and the violences of those, right? And he talks about this entire history being one of blood and fire, right? And that's the violence behind that allows this nice liberal society to come into being. And also that liberal society requires violence all the time in order to keep itself functioning.
The history of liberalism is inextricably tied to the white man's burden. Likewise, the formation of capital cannot be delinked from colonialism, slavery, and expropriation. Capitalism is violence. It may seem like a walk in the park for the contemporary professional managerial class in the West, but that comfort is built upon a foundation of carnage, theft, and destitution at the margins. We don't see that. As the war machine keeps turning. In all 500 pages, you'll scarcely find a mention of colonialism at all, arguably the main conduit for the spread of liberalism. In order to find his actual thoughts on it, we have to turn to his 2014 effort on the decline of violence, Better Angels of Our Nature. The book espouses the rather boring and conventional take that, yeah, some bad things happen, but who cares because progress. Past injustices, the logic goes, are merely evidence of the failure to properly apply liberal values. But that over the centuries, a benign process of trial and error paved the way for the ultimate success of liberalism. This comic book retelling of history benefits from an equally selective definition of violence. While Pinker eagerly tallies data on homicide, genocide, torture, and battle deaths, when it comes to the violence of economics and coercive working conditions, he regards these forms as metaphorical. So these points don't count on Pinker's scoreboard, despite the fact that, as Hitchens already pointed out, a couple people died. Metaphorically, that is. You don't have to be the literal victim of a stabbing for there to be violence. More often than not, it manifests as structural intent to dominate others through control or force. Convenient, narrow, and selective definitions are a reoccurring theme in Pinker's work. Enlightenment Now skates the edge of justifying the colonial project through the erasure of its legacy. For him, it's just something that was in the past and that we all got over. In Pinker's world, countries that haven't yet succeeded just got the economic formula wrong. On the Somalia to Sweden continuum of nations, the world divides into poor, violent, repressive, unhappy countries at one end, and rich, peaceful, liberal, happy ones on the other. The one constant being GDP. It's just that simple, whole countries. Just be richer and more like Sweden. Can't be that hard. It is true that richer countries are better off by nearly every metric. Well spotted, Pinker. But why are they richer? Who knows? But hey, let's look at this map for no reason. See these countries in green? They were all colonized by Europe at some point. Hey, that's where all the poor countries are. Oh wait, my bad. Some of those countries are actually pretty rich and liberal. Guess that puts an end to my little history matters theory. But hold on a sec. Didn't Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand win independence like 100 or 200 years ago? Meaning they all got like a full century head start on all these other countries in green? And weren't they also like the only colonies that weren't exploited for their labor and minerals? Yeah, I guess they kind of were. What a coinky-dink. Oh, darling, stop being so drab. That's old news. It's time to move on. Look around you. Things are good now. Have some gratitude for all that liberalism has achieved. Well, to evaluate the assertion that more capitalism equals more progress, let's just take what we already know about the poverty stats, map them onto the real world, and see how they fit.
From 1980 to 2000, the number of people under $5 a day increased from 70.8% to 73% due to the structural adjustment programs that were imposed by the World Bank and IMF during this period.
Structural adjustment programs are predatory loans imposed upon underdeveloped nations in exchange for liberalization of trade barriers to advanced industrialized economies, while slashing subsidies, social spending, capital controls, reversing land reforms, and privatizing public assets, all in the face of predictable massive public resistance.
In other words, precisely during the period when free market globalization was at its purest and most aggressive, global poverty was getting worse. Not just in absolute terms, but proportionally as well. For Pinker's claim to work, he can't include China, where economic integration has been on state-led terms. Take China out, and the percentage of people earning under $5 a day increased from 62% in 1980 to 67% in 2000, and did not improve on its 1980 levels until 2010.
He says, if you really want to reduce poverty, what you should want is something as close as possible to a free market, and the China point just completely obliterates that, because whatever you think about China and exactly how you want to classify China's kind of economically liberalized, still kind of Stalinist, hybrid, one thing you cannot call it is anything that anybody would mistake for a free market, right? There's a massive amount of state intervention in the market, and so if this is the source of your poverty statistics, you can't claim, or you can't honestly claim, that those statistics support the idea that what we want is something as close as possible to a completely free market.
This point bears repeating. China and South Korea saw enormous GDP growth throughout the 90s and 2000s precisely because they ignored the standard IMF and World Bank line on predatory trade liberalization that crippled so many other economies that complied with Western demands. The promise of capitalism was that its unprecedented productivity, efficiency, and rate of technological innovation would make hunger, poverty, and war a thing of the past. And yes, you can make a superficial case for the decline of war and violence, as Pinker did. It would be wrong, but you can make a much better case that colonialism and conventional war merely evolved into increasingly veiled forms of economic imperialism and structural violence, which are still very bad and which still very much kill people. Which brings me back to hunger and poverty. Aside from the core capitalist states in China, where the vast majority of global wealth is funneled, we haven't really made a dent. And that's largely because our basic measuring tools for things like poverty and quality of life aren't up to the task. They were never meant to. Here's what I mean. Unlike their agrarian ancestors, the modern poor, while comparatively richer in material wealth and an assortment of other indicators, have the privilege of being subject to record levels of water and air pollution, ocean acidification, mass extinction, global warming-induced extreme weather, forest fires, soil erosion, and a proliferating array of diseases of poverty, byproducts of the very industries that dispossess them in the first place.
Progress.
These fun side effects are what we call externalities. We've always had them, but capitalism turns them up to 11. They are the social, economic, health, and environmental costs that go uncounted in a corporate or state ledger. What we gain in productive efficiencies, we often lose somewhere else. Take health, for example. Stinker cites longer lives and eradication of many diseases as signs of progress. He fails to mention that we are now witnessing the first generation that will die earlier than their parents. Technical fixes to old problems, coupled with the demands of profit, have set the stage for a new set of diseases of modern life. Skyrocketing rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer, autism, and drug-resistant superbugs are just a few of the neat new puzzles we find ourselves in. Remember lead poisoning and asbestos?
Progress.
Because capitalism is a competitive and infinite growth system, the only metrics considered in the international system of accounts are things like gross domestic product, employment rate, price index, average income, inflation, imports and exports. In the corporate world, accounting is likewise reduced to year-over-year profits and expense reports. Having collectively adopted these standardized measuring tools over the last century, virtually all national activity has become subsumed to tweaking these numbers. Instead of, trying to build a better society. Because that's what gets measured. Minor changes in these stats are what make the headlines, and it's how countries compete against each other.
We pay attention to measurements and judge success and failure by quantifiable outcomes. A society that has made a religion of quantification is the only sort of society in which progress will become the norm.
This is the trick that allows states to point to their books and declare, everything's going swimmingly, despite the world burning all around them. For example, let's say unemployment rates are at all-time lows. Seems like a good thing, right? Well, not so fast. What the number doesn't tell you is that many people have just given up looking for work altogether, and that those jobs are all part-time, low-wage, temporary, zero benefits, and many people are working 2 or 3 of them.
Let me tell you something. We're talking about jobs, but the quality of those jobs with poultry workers in the richest country in the world, the United States. Dolores, one woman we work with there, told us that she and her co-workers have to wear diapers to work because they are not allowed toilet breaks. This is in the richest country in the world. So don't tell me about low levels of unemployment. You are counting the wrong things. You're not counting dignity of people. You're counting exploited people.
Progress.
Pinker wouldn't know that by looking at the numbers alone, because the numbers are often misleading and don't tell the whole story. They can't, they're just numbers. And this is widely understood among economists. But Pinker's thesis relies on him not understanding it, so he can say things like, the numbers don't lie. The effect of his onslaught of stats and graphs
is to kill off the idea that if things are getting better for some of us, it must be because others are suffering so that we may thrive. In the US,
progress
now has to be preached because it can no longer be taken for granted. Their life expectancy is failing, suicide rates are rising, incomes are stagnating.
But Daddy Stinker's no slouch. He anticipated critiques like this, so he includes sections purporting to measure the less tangible things that make up quality of life. The most precious resources of all, time, freedom, and worthy experiences, are all rising across the board. Yes, indeed. Let's talk about time, freedom, and worthy experiences under neoliberal capitalism. First, time. Pinker submits as evidence a graph that shows weekly work hours decreasing from north of 60 a century ago to under 40 now. Not only does he fail to mention that these victories were all won by an organized labor movement in opposition to the capitalist class, but he's curiously silent on why that number has been rising since 1970 and why the graph ends at 2000. It's neoliberalism, which is the deepening and intensifying of capitalism. But of course, Stinker's official numbers mask the reality. In 2014, full-time American workers reported an average of 47 hours per week and 13% reported working multiple jobs. He then submits as evidence stats showing the sharp decrease in housework brought about by technologies like the washing machine and microwave. And it's true that the former drudgery of domestic labor has improved by leaps and bounds in the modern era. But what does that have to do with capitalism? The Soviets had refrigerators, washing machines, and microwaves too. Plus, they kinda beat America in the space race. So given these hard-won labor fights and advances in technology, surely a rational system like capitalism would harness this energy and produce more free time, not less. Right? Wrong. A core feature of capitalism is that it colonizes free time. Just gets in there. If you, like me, are a person that exists, then you may have noticed that over the last couple decades, technological innovation has increased at breakneck speeds, yet the workday hasn't gotten any shorter. That's strange. In fact, for most of us, work has crept into our free time. Cell phones, laptops, and the internet means we're expected to be in touch at all hours, reading emails, communicating with clients, planning meetings, preparing presentations. On top of that, we need to curate our personal brands on social media and LinkedIn to stay appealing and relevant to potential employers. Because no one's expected to stay at a job for more than a couple years anymore. Not included in the calculation is the time spent preparing for work in the morning, and the increasingly long commute times caused by gentrification and a real estate bubble in the city centers where all the jobs are, that's pricing out all the people who actually work there. Ever worked a salary job where your work was finished in the first 3 hours, so the rest of the day you're forced to find ways to pretend to look busy? I have.
George, I think you may be taking work a little too seriously.
Well, I've got a lot to do.
Have you noticed that your free time is increasingly commodified? Video games you've already paid for now keep asking you to pay up to keep the game going and stay competitive. Every minute of your day you're being sold to on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Netflix, your drive home from work, and your YouTube subscriptions. Please pay me money. That's colonization of time. Under capitalism, time is a commodity and you live to work rather than work to live. Next up, freedom. It isn't free. Costs folk like you and me. What have you got for us, Professor? For this claim, Pinker doesn't actually give us any graphs or argument to consider. In Chapter 17, he just kind of lumps together time, cheaper goods, and air travel, and calls that freedom, from what I can gather anyway. But that's okay. I've got a much better version of freedom for us to talk about. Freedom to control how you work, what you work on, and what to do with the finished product. Agency, autonomy, that's what true freedom means. Not the ability to choose from 35 different sneakers at Foot Locker. The denial of this freedom is what Marx calls alienation. I have no idea what you've just said, but so what? If both the material conditions and income of the global poor have improved, then how can you stand there and say we're not better off because of capitalism? Well, for starters, what about the total and unprecedented collapse of mental health?
I noticed that lots of the people I know who are depressed and anxious, their depression and anxiety focuses around their work. So I started to look at, well, what's the evidence about this? How do people feel about their work? And it was quite striking. So Gallup did the best research on that here in the US and across the world. Massive 3-year detailed study. What they found is 13% of us, 13%, like their work most of the time. 63% of us are what they called sleepworking. You don't like it, you don't hate it, you just kind of get through the day. And 24% of people fucking hate and fear their jobs, right? I was really struck by that. 87% of people don't like the thing they're doing most of their waking life, right? So I think, could this have some role to play in our mental health problems? So I started to look at all the evidence around this, and I learned there was an incredible man who I went to meet called Professor Michael Marmot, who discovered, he's an Australian social scientist, and he discovered in the 1970s, it's not the only one, but the single biggest factor that causes depression at work. He discovered if you go to work tomorrow and you have low or no control over your job, you are much more likely to become depressed and anxious by a really significant amount. He kept stressing, it's not the work that makes you depressed, it's being controlled at work. And so I think, well, what's the kind of solution for that? What's the antidepressant for that? And I learned there's really good evidence for this. So I went to meet in Baltimore a woman called Meredith Keogh, who's a totally interesting person. Meredith used to go to bed every Sunday night, just sick with anxiety, right? She had an office job, and she would tell you it wasn't the worst office job in the world. She wasn't being bullied or, harassed or anything. But it was really monotonous, and she couldn't bear the thought, this is going to be the next 40 years of my life till I retire, whatever it would have been, 45 hours a week. So one day with her husband Josh, she decided to do this quite bold thing. So Josh, her husband, had worked in bike stores since he was a teenager in Baltimore. And, as you can imagine, it's insecure work. You've got very little control over it. You don't have any rights at work, really. You don't even get paid vacation time. And one day, Josh and his friends who worked in the store just asked themselves, what does our boss actually do, right? They liked their boss. He wasn't a terrible person, but they were like, we seem to fix all the bikes and he seems to make all the money. They decided they were going to set up a bike store of their own that worked on a different principle. So where they had worked before was a corporation. Very recent human invention, goes back to the 19th century. This is, people will know it because most people listening to this will work in a corporation. You've got like the boss at the top and everyone who's like the commander of the army, and everyone below them is like a soldier that takes their orders, and sometimes the commander is nice and asks your opinion, sometimes he doesn't. They decided they were going to open a bike store that worked on a different principle, an older American principle. It's a democratic cooperative. So they don't have a boss. They
fired their boss and he had to go on antidepressants.
He was a sad, broken figure.
Yeah.
So they open this bike store, and so they take the decisions together by voting. Like once every couple of weeks. In practice, they agree on almost everything anyway. They share out the profits. They share out the good tasks and the shitty tasks, so no one gets stuck with the shitty tasks. But they're one of 10,000 democratic cooperatives in the US. It's a growing number. But what was fascinating spending time with the people in Baltimore Bicycle Works, their store, which is totally in line with Professor Marmot's findings, is how many of them talked about how they'd been depressed and anxious before, but were not depressed and anxious now. And what's interesting is it's not like, they didn't quit their jobs fixing bikes and go off to become like Beyonce's backing singers, right? They fixed bikes before, they fix bikes now. The difference is now they've got control over their work. Now, if they have an idea, they can translate it into practice, that if they can persuade their colleagues. It's a very different way of being in your daily life, right? Now, there's no reason why we should be structuring the way we work, the thing we do most of the time, in a way that depresses and humiliates so many people, right? Every corporation could be turned into a democratic cooperative. That sounds like a big thing. We've lived through enormous changes, you and I. That is about understanding a deep cause of depression and anxiety. People are soaking up a huge amount of humiliation or just plain boredom at work. And by restoring control to people, they can infuse their work with meaning in a way which of course doesn't mean, of course there's still going to be some jobs that have to be done that are not the best jobs in the world when it comes to creativity. But the more you get, and there's scientific research about this, the more you give people control over their work, the more they find meaning in that work.
Alienation from community and the product of one's labor are at the heart of not only the mental health epidemic, but of antisocial behavior more broadly. Thus, alienation is both the precondition and consequence of capitalism. Knowing this, if our goal is to make healthier, happier humans, then we need a socioeconomic system that frees us to treat humans humanely. Now, let's put this into perspective with Pinker's free market capitalism and the cognitive dissonance that occurs between valorizing democracy on the one hand and tolerating authoritarianism in the workplace. We vote for the town dog catcher and the next American Idol, but when it comes to work, arguably the very thing that gives life meaning, we don't think twice about laboring under unaccountable private tyrannies. And neither does Pinker. For a guy who purports to champion liberal values,
Pinker's Enlightenment is shorn of its most egalitarian and democratic elements. It certainly bears no resemblance to the intellectual ferment of the French Revolution.
The whole point of which was to overthrow the monarchy, aristocracy, and clergy, and replace them with a democratic humanist republic in service of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Instead, Pinker's capitalist Enlightenment mimics the hierarchy, conservatism, and authoritarianism of the Ancien Regime, that historical enemy of radical enlightenment.
Progress.
You could call it that. I call it accumulation by dispossession, expropriation of the commons, exploitation, and alienation. The consolation prize of bananas, a cell phone, and a couple of bucks does not make up for what was taken.
You feel, however, that we're making progress in this country and worldwide?
No. I will never say that progress is being made. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. You pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made. They won't even admit the knife is there.
I should point out that Pinker does pay lip service to all these values of progressivism, cooperation, and mutual care when he describes humanism. But here's the rub. Rather than address how social systems and modes of production like capitalism might affect these variables, he instead takes a wild detour to warn us against what he sees as the true enemies of progress: religion, ideology, and social justice warriors. Intellectuals hate progress. Intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. SJWs are unreasonable. I am very intelligent. These cultural foes represent an existential threat to Pinker's liberal project. The way he sees it, politics, and by extension progress, play out principally according to the algorithms embedded in our cultural software. It is our values and ideas that shape our material conditions, according to his way of thinking. Paradoxically, this formulation cements Pinker firmly in the same ideological camp as the boorish intersectional SJW foes he claims to rail against. They're making the same mistake. It is Pinker's major malfunction, his error 404. He has it backwards. It is the nature of our productive activities and material conditions that gives rise to our politics, our culture, and the shape of progress.
The idea of primitive accumulation, right? So the Marxist idea that capitalism actually was not born out of this liberal ideal of some people working really hard and consolidating money and, the various liberal myths that even Adam Smith talks about to some extent. But instead, if we empirically look at the rise of capitalism, we can see that it was constructed through concentration of power, through laws like enclosure and the bloody legislation, and through capitalist dictatorship.
Capitalism didn't emerge because it was dreamed up by liberals as an alternate mode of production to be debated in the marketplace of ideas.
My brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
It emerged historically out of the contradictions of feudalism, new technologies, and shifting institutional power dynamics. The significance of ideas and culture is in the degree to which they mask or reveal one's place in the class structure. So my question to Pinker is, why champion a system so antithetical to your stated values? Why are you so wedded to class society? Why limit democracy and humanism to the political realm? Why not call for the erosion of the dividing lines between political, economic, and social activity altogether? I'll tell you why. Because Stinker's imagination is serving a life sentence in the liberal mind prison with no chance of parole.
Everybody knows the fight was fixed. The poor stay poor, the rich get rich. That's how it goes. Everybody knows.
On top of serving as an overeager membership application to hang out at the Rich Kids Club, Enlightenment Now is in part a rebuttal to Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Piketty's monumental collection of historical data shows in great detail how wealth inequality corrodes social bonds, democracy, and economic stability. Furthermore, he illustrates how the trend towards exponential growth in inequality observed in capitalism is a key feature, not a bug. The release of Capital, to great fanfare and critical acclaim, was clearly a triggering experience for Stinker, having lost control of the progress narrative to a Debbie Downer like Piketty after having held the title for the previous 3 years with his last big hit, Better Angels of Our Nature.
You also mentioned inequality, which is a big discussion point right now in the world today. The World Bank, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, even all of these august institutions are saying inequality is a problem, it hurts growth. You have books like The Spirit Level linking rising income inequality to higher rates of homicide, imprisonment, infant mortality, mental illness. And yet you say in the book, economic inequality is not in itself a dimension of human well-being.
That's right.
So in defiance of the academic consensus, Pinker's take on inequality is that A, it's not itself a dimension of well-being, aka it's irrelevant, and B, it's all natural, baby. Let's address this one first.
Baby, I was born this way.
Capitalism, he contends, is the right fit because it doles out uneven rewards to a population with uneven talent distribution and work ethic. The problem with the left, he argues, is that they equate unequal distribution with unfairness.
What people sometimes think of as an aversion to inequality, to people having different amounts, is actually an aversion to unfairness.
Right, to injustice.
What really infuriates people is that they think that the people at the top have ill-gotten gains.
Right.
People, if they sense that the system is basically fair, that either greater effort, talent, or even luck result in an unequal distribution, an impartial lottery, for example, they're okay with that. It's cheating that really gets under.
Yeah.
Here's how he backs this up. Many studies in psychology have shown that people, including young children, prefer windfalls to be split evenly among participants, even if everyone ends up with less overall. That led some psychologists to posit a syndrome called inequality aversion, an apparent desire to spread the wealth. But in their recent article, Why People Prefer Unequal Societies, the psychologists Christina Starmans, Mark Sheshkin, and Paul Bloom took another look at the studies and found that people prefer unequal distributions both among fellow participants in the lab and among citizens in their countries, as long as they sense the allocation is fair, that the bonuses go to harder workers, more generous helpers, or even the lucky winners of an impartial lottery. Pinker is trying to pull a fast one on the reader by citing this study. He's trying to leave us with the impression that most people are totally okay with the inequality that we see today. It's only those hysterical leftists that are making a fuss. And who can take them seriously, am I right? Well, how about we take a closer look at what kind of inequality people are actually okay with?
A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution, and 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have.
That's not quite how you made it seem, Pinker. So yes, humans may be willing to instinctively tolerate some level of unequal distribution in rewards, if it seems fair. I am of the view that after having basic needs met, you should be rewarded in proportion to the amount and difficulty of the work you do. I don't think that's an unreasonable position. The problem is that fair distribution isn't how capitalism works, nor was it ever meant to. Think women's work, PSWs, nurses, teachers, midwives, daycare providers, untenured professors. Then think Martin Shkreli, the Kardashians, Spencer Pratt, Goldman Sachs executives, hot bartenders, trust fund babies, and Lil Pump. In this way, capitalism not only skews the type of work that gets rewarded, its productivity amplifies the gulf in compensation between work that capital values and work that society values. Is it natural that PSWs slave away 80 hours a week making minimum wage while Luigi the slumlord makes 7 figures speculating on the housing market? I'll leave that one up to the philosophers. So let's take a quick look at where the capitalist meritocracy has landed us. It's had a couple hundred years to work out some of the kinks and let that wealth trickle down. So where are we at? To start, here's what things look like in 2012 America.
Let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Now, let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%? This guy? Well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years.
But wait! There's more!
From 1980 to 2016, the ratio of pay for the average American corporate CEO to the average worker grew from 42 to 1 to 347 to 1, as the percentage of national income held by the richest 1% doubled. As of 2017, the world's richest 1% owned half the world's wealth. In 2018, that same 1% earned 82% of all new wealth. As of 2019, the top 0.9% owned 43% of global wealth. That's 158 trillion, while the bottom 56% own under 2% of total wealth. In the United States, not counting Social Security, the top 1/10 of 1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%.
Progress.
So unless you unironically believe that Jeff Bezos works 1 billion times harder than a Mexican migrant worker, unequal but fair is not an accurate description of the system we live under. But if we really want to judge the fairness of capitalism, we have to look beyond mere outcomes. We must analyze its inner logic as a system. Inequality is not the result of maldistribution of wealth, but rather occurs at the point of production. It is the very fact of making things for a profit that requires workers to be underpaid for their labor. It is in this technical sense that capitalism is predicated on exploitation. It doesn't matter that your boss invested $1 million of his hard-earned money, took the risk, came up with a brilliant idea, pays you generously, or takes you on fun trips. He may be the greatest boss on earth, but his business still relies on the exploitation of your labor. More importantly, what you need to realize is that your nice life, nice job, and nice boss depend upon the deep and intense exploitation of dark-skinned people in faraway lands.
Progress.
So those children who said that unequal distribution was justified if it meant the rewards went to harder workers or givers, Pinker would have us believe that this global network of exploitation is really what these kids were sanctioning all along. I'm not convinced. So with that out of the way, let's move on to his main argument, the one that everything hinges on.
I got 50 Bentleys in the West Indies.
It doesn't matter!
This is a strange one for Pinker to make, mostly because no serious economist actually agrees with him. Even his big-brain centrist brother-in-arms and fellow hierarchy fanboy, Jordan Peterson, acknowledges that, left unchecked, the inherent proclivity of hierarchical systems like capitalism is to produce catastrophic inequality.
The left wing, though, says, and to their credit, yeah, but you have to be very careful with your hierarchies because they tend towards inequality of distribution. That's one problem. Once they're established, they always also tend to a form of tyranny because once a hierarchy of competence has been established, it can be invaded by people who use power as the means to attain status in the hierarchy. And that can corrupt and destroy even the entire hierarchy. So you have to be on guard for that. Plus, if your hierarchy becomes too steep in its distribution, so it's too tiny a fraction of people at the top and too great an agglomeration of people at the bottom, especially under conditions of genuine privation, then the people at the bottom, it's not only unjust and unfair and producing excess suffering, but the people at the bottom have nothing to lose and might as well just flip the hierarchy on its end. And that's not a good way to produce a sustainable society. You don't want to put people in a position where they have nothing to lose.
Stinker's answer is that the only reliable way to alleviate global poverty is to increase a country's total wealth. And in order to increase a country's total wealth, and increase in absolute inequality, the difference between the richest and the poorest, is almost a mathematical necessity. Now, unlike the interesting rates of death by poison,
How neat is that?
he offers up no math and no graphs to back up this spurious claim.
That's pretty neat.
But let's for a moment assume he's right. He isn't. The assertion still says nothing about what the optimal distribution of wealth ought to be, which is an underhanded way of saying all distributions are equally benign, because to admit otherwise would drastically undermine his entire thesis. But before we dig into the studies, let's enjoy a blast from the past and investigate where Pinker might have found some clues in his search for truth. had he been looking? First, to recent history, then right back to the Enlightenment itself, and beyond. Our first source of forgotten historical wisdom comes from Steven Pinker. 17 years ago, in his book The Blank Slate, Pinker considered that if social status is relative, then extreme inequality can make the people on the lower rungs of society feel defeated. Young Pinker sees real consequences. It is not just a matter of hurt feelings. People with lower status are less healthy and die younger, and communities with greater inequality have poor health and shorter life expectancies. But that was old and busted Pinker. New Hotness Pinker celebrates inequality as a harbinger of opportunity. Traveling back further, what did the relevant texts and treaties of the time have to say about inequality? Let's start with the godfather of capitalism himself, Adam Smith. What were his thoughts?
A man of great fortune, a nobleman, is much farther removed from the condition of his servant than a farmer. The disproportion betwixt them, the condition of the nobleman and his servant, is so great that he will hardly look at him as being of the same kind. He thinks he has little title even to the ordinary enjoyments of life, and feels but little for his misfortunes.
Even Smith could see that dehumanization and othering was an inherent and corrosive feature of class societies.
Men feel so little for each other, with whom they have no particular connection, in comparison of what they feel for themselves.
Yeah, Pinker skipped class that day. Who else can we ask? Pinker cites Jean-Jacques Rousseau occasionally. What did he have to say on, say, wealth accumulation?
The rich had hardly learned about the pleasure of dominating, that they soon disdained all others, and, making use of their old slaves to subject new ones, dreamed only of subjugating and enslaving their neighbors, like those ravenous wolves which, having once tasted human flesh, reject all other food and no longer want to devour anything but men.
Rousseau cautioned that the capacity to manipulate the poor too easily becomes a measure of a rich person's power and status. The pursuit of great wealth is therefore intimately tied with the repression of others. It is not acquired in a vacuum of bootstrappiness as a benevolent endeavor. But why stop here? Let's go all the way back. In the Bible, the book of Amos tells a similar tale of how the rich earned God's wrath by plundering the poor for sport. Jesus Christ famously threw shade on a young entrepreneur type looking for advice on how to get into heaven, when he replied,
"It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God."
Chad looks stunned and upset, so Jesus goes,
"Alright, I'm kidding, man. There's still hope for you. Here's what you gotta do.
Go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me."
When the young man heard this, he went away sad.
Yeah, Chad didn't love the idea. Even farther back, Plato cautioned that
it is impossible that those who become very rich become also good. Like, what do you expect, you ding dong? They're stealing from you. They're robbing you blind, like right in your face.
Alright, we get it. The wise guys frowned upon wealth inequality. Cool story. But what does that tell us about right now? I'm sure you'll admit you'd rather live in the present than in their time. I thought you'd never ask. Since all these dead white guys were mostly interested in the social and psychological effects, let's start there. A large 2017 study that questioned almost 42,000 people across 27 countries found that the larger the inequality in a society, the more the privileged group supports the hierarchy. People in this group will also be more willing to use violence in order to keep their position. Great, so the richer you are in relation to everyone else, the more you become a sadistic psychopath. More recently, the social psychologist Dr. Keltner demonstrated that the wealthier people are, the more difficult it is for them to uphold basic norms of decency and reciprocity. Trust is tightly correlated to economic inequality. In a massive 2018 meta-analysis of the literature, authors found that 16 of the 26 studies found a significant positive relationship between income inequality and risk of depression.
When I feel depressed, like loads of people, I say I feel down, right? And as I was learning about the causes of depression and anxiety for my book Lost Connections, I started to realise I don't think that's a metaphor. There's this amazing professor at Stanford called Robert Sapolsky, who in his early 20s went to live with a troop of baboons in Kenya. And it was his job to figure out when are baboons most stressed out. So his job was to hit them with little tranquilizer darts and then take a blood test and measure something called cortisol, which is a hormone that baboons and us release when we're stressed. And baboons live in this hierarchy, so the females don't, interestingly, but the men live in a very strict hierarchy. So if there's 30 men, number 1 knows he's above number 2, number 2 knows he's above number 3, number 12 knows he's above number 13, and that really determines a lot. It determines who you get to have sex with, it determines what you get to eat, it determines whether you get to sit in the shade or you're pushed out into the heat. You know, it's a really, really significant where you are in the hierarchy. And what Professor Sapolsky found is baboons are most stressed in 2 situations. One is when their status is insecure. So if you're the top guy and someone's circling, which comes for you, you will be massively stressed. And the other situation is when you feel you're at the bottom of a hierarchy. You've been kind of humiliated. And what Professor Sapolsky found, which I think is really noticed and then it was later developed by other scientists, is when you feel you've been pushed to the bottom, what you do is you show something called a submission gesture. So baboons will raise, I say you, I assume no baboons are watching this, maybe they are. A baboon will put its body down physically, it will put its head down, it will put its bottom in the air, and it will cover its head. So it clearly seems to be communicating, just leave me alone, you've beaten me, okay, you've beaten me. And what lots of scientists have subsequently developed, people like Professor Paul Gilbert in Britain and Professor Kate Pickett and Professor Richard Wilkinson, also in Britain, have really developed is this idea that actually what human depression is in part, not entirely, but in part, is a form of a submission gesture. It's a way of saying, I can't cope with this anymore, right? Particularly people who feel they've been pushed to the bottom of hierarchies, or who feel, remember the other stressful situations when you feel your status is insecure. It's a way of just going, okay, I retreat, I don't want this fight anymore. You've beaten me. It's a kind of very strong evolutionary impulse where you feel you're under attack to just submit in the hope that the stress and anxiety will then go away, that the sources of the stress and anxiety will then go away. And one thing that's so important, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson really developed this, is they've shown, so as inequality grows, depression and anxiety grow. They've shown this is a very robust effect, right? This helps us to explain it. If you live in Norway, your status is relatively secure, right? No one's that high, no one's that low. Movement between where you are is not so extreme. If you live in the United States, especially today, we're now at the greatest levels of inequality since the 1920s, there's a few people at the very top, there's a kind of precarious middle, and there's a huge and swelling bottom, right? So you can see why in the United States you've got more people who'd be showing a submission gesture, who'd be like, oh Jesus, I've been beaten, than there would be in Norway. This is why inequality is one of the drivers of depression and anxiety, and why dealing with inequality reduces inequality and anxiety. It's one of the things that really shocked me actually, was looking at in the United States, the group with the lowest depression by far is the Amish. So I went and spent time with an Amish community. The Amish live in these homogenous groups which are incredibly equal. The richest Amish is worth as much as the poorest Amish, right? But we can learn from the fact that in these highly equal and homogenous groups, you don't have that extreme status stress. Now, I don't want to go as far as the Amish do, but moving closer to it would be one of the factors that would reduce depression and anxiety.
The World Health Organization released data showing that people in more equal societies are far less likely to experience mental illness. In 1996, the editor of the British Medical Journal hypothesized that the big idea is that what matters in determining mortality and health in society is less the overall wealth of that society, and more how evenly wealth is distributed. The more equally the wealth is distributed, the better the health of that society. Since then, the big idea has been widely tested. More than 200 peer-reviewed studies of the association have been published. Income inequality has been variously associated with lower life expectancy, higher rates of infant and child mortality, shorter height, poor self-reported health, low birth weight, AIDS, depression, mental illness, and obesity. An American study confirmed this theme. They found a significant correlation between the percentage of total household income received by the less well-off 50% in each state and all-cause mortality. In addition, income inequality was also significantly associated with age-specific mortalities and rates of low birth weight, homicide, violent crime, work disability, expenditures on medical care and police protection, smoking, and sedentary activity. Rates of unemployment, imprisonment, recipients of income assistance and food stamps, lack of medical insurance, and educational outcomes were also worse as income inequality increased. Oddly enough, it sounds like Pinker is kind of aware of all this data, he just doesn't believe it. In addition to the effects on individual psychology, inequality has been linked to several different kinds of society-wide dysfunction, including economic stagnation, financial instability, intergenerational immobility, and political influence peddling. These harms must be taken seriously. But here too, the leap from correlation to causation has been contested. Sorry. Contested by who, you ask? Some guy from the Manhattan Institute who wrote a short opinion piece for the Washington Post claiming, without evidence, that the key to poverty reduction is economic growth, and that we needn't worry about inequality. So, despite all the literature, all the studies, one guy from a neoliberal think tank has doubts. And that's enough to convince you. Off to a good start. Now, normally I would trust some random neoliberal shill, but just for kicks, let's check the data anyway.
This graph shows the share of world GDP between developed and emerging countries evening out over the last 15 years. But it should be noted that while many societies are getting richer, inequality within those societies is frequently on the rise, and the bottom billion countries like Afghanistan, Angola, Azerbaijan, Benin, Bhutan, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, and Burundi, to name a few, are falling behind. The question, of course, is why?
Because the system doesn't work unless some are left behind. So growth alone isn't enough. And if you're a numbers guy like Stinker, the apparent stunted growth of the West and developing nations should be cause for further investigation. You'd think. Good thing the OECD did just that. The single biggest impact on growth is the widening gap between the lower middle class and poor households compared to the rest of society. Rising inequality is estimated to have knocked more than 10 percentage points off growth in Mexico and New Zealand over the past 2 decades up to the Great Recession. The paper finds new evidence that the main mechanism through which inequality affects growth is by undermining educational opportunities for children from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, lowering social mobility, and hampering skills development. Anti-poverty programs will not be enough, says the OECD. Cash transfers and increasing access to public services are an essential social investment. But here's the cherry on top. The paper also finds no evidence that redistributive policies such as taxes and social benefits harm economic growth. To reiterate, the more free the market, the greater the inequality, and the more stunted the economic growth. Neoclassical economic theory relies on the rationality of free market capitalism to produce optimal outcomes, which is why Pinker is so gay for markets. But hang on a minute. Earlier, he claimed that the dusty old welfare state was a key element in well-being. Welfare isn't rational. Universal healthcare and food stamps don't leave room for rational things like individual utility maximization based on perfect information, or complex equations for free market Disneyland. You don't reason your way into the most optimal emergency room when you cut your finger off. A robust welfare state just takes care of those concerns for you.
Why he makes this concession is unclear, and nothing is said about human kindness or fairness in his formula. Indeed, the logic of his dictum points the other way.
Which is strange, given that the entire purpose of the welfare state is to shield capitalist economies from economic crises by, let's say, raising the floor, establishing a social safety net, regulating big business, and trimming off excess wealth from the top. That kind of sounds a lot like reducing wealth inequality not only fosters some kind of economic growth, but might contribute to some kind of improvement in well-being? Wait, but didn't he say earlier that wealth inequality... Look everyone, it's Pinker's arch nemesis, Thomas Piketty, and he's come back for the kill shot with his new book. Piketty's 2019 1,200-page follow-up to Capital, titled Capital and Ideology, looks to put the nail in the coffin of the capitalist neoliberal fantasy once and for all. In it, he methodically lays out the only possible path for a stable economic future. One with no billionaires.
Billionaires, 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 billionaires. I am not a billionaire.
How can we justify that their existence is necessary for the common good? Contrary to what is often said, their enrichment was obtained thanks to these collective goods, which are the public knowledge, the infrastructures, the laboratories of research.
To reconcile this fact, the book calls for wealth redistribution on a massive scale, including a graduated wealth tax of 5% on those worth 2 million euros or more, and up to 90% on those worth more than 2 billion euros. But in case that wasn't clear, Piketty makes explicit the real consequences of Pinker's cherished laissez-faire neoliberalism.
Reaganism has shown its limits. Growth has been halved, inequalities have doubled. It is time to break out of this phase of sacredness of property, to overcome capitalism.
Yeah, whatever, Piketty. Cool book. But have you seen this? Oh man, he's so screwed. Pinker's favorite graph on this topic is the Milanovich elephant graph. The chart tracks the changes in income distribution from 1988 to 2008. He likes it because it seems to show that the biggest gains went to the bulk of the middle class and the 1%, while the upper middle class and poor gained the least, but still gained. The time frame, of course, perfectly maps on to the left's favorite boogeyman, that of the dreaded neoliberal globalization. The period we're currently in, when social services and taxes were slashed, government assets were privatized, unions crushed, and regulations cut. The cliché about globalization is that it creates winners and losers, and the elephant curve displays them as peaks and valleys. It reveals that the winners include most of humanity. Geez, I mean, looking at that graph, it seems pretty airtight. Looks like the bottom 60% receive the bulk of the gains. Have we been wrong this whole time? Yet again, enter Jason Hickel. First, he and a colleague decided to update the graph to include all the relevant data from 1980 to 2016. But then we have to account for the fact that this graph is measuring relative gains, relative to their baseline level in 1980. It's kind of like those health studies that come out saying spam consumption increases your risk of toenail cancer by 150%, when they neglect to mention that the total risk is still 0.00032. The point is, stats can always be manipulated to serve your particular agenda. So what happens when Hickel takes the new data and renders it in absolute numbers instead of relative? Oh. Hey, that kind of reminds me of another graph. As Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz explains in his book The Price of Inequality, another one of the key reasons for this negative impact on economic growth is rent-seeking behavior. When a greater share of wealth and power is concentrated in fewer hands, those hands have greater ability to tease out subsidies, privatization, deregulation, tax exemptions, lucrative contracts, and favorable treatment from government. These market distortions have been shown to negatively affect economic growth and development. Stiglitz goes on to show that the meteoric rise of the 0.1% necessarily leaves less for the poor and middle classes, the latter of which is currently being hollowed out. A dying middle class spells disaster. A robust middle class is essential because its purchasing power is what creates demand for all the products and services that create and sustain good jobs. Without anyone left to pay for all the houses, cars, 4K TVs, mani-pedis, vacations, and personal trainers, the jobs disappear and we risk devolving into a banana republic.
Well, one thing to think is that this concentration of wealth actually kind of creates a huge amount of distortions and volatility in the economy. So you have real wages staying flat or falling for most of the population. That means that the aggregate demand, the consumer buying demand of people at the bottom and the middle is really not as engaged. And then at the very top, you have this unreal concentration of assets, which leads to sort of some unreal risk-taking, meaning people at the very top, I'm talking about, the top 1% of households, are starting to move and a portion of their wealth into more financially speculative investments, investments that get higher returns than the real economy, which isn't, returning a lot in terms of interest or earnings. So you have this twin dynamic. You have stagnant wages on the bottom, and then you have concentrated wealth at the top, looking more and more, venturing into the sort of speculative arena of the marketplace. And all of that leads to certain volatility, huge volatility. So just take the energy market today, or over the last couple of months, or real estate in major urban areas. Those are all local and national and global economies that are that are being distorted by these great inequities of wealth.
Earlier, we talked about the importance of fair compensation. Well, it turns out that, according to Stiglitz, employee productivity is also affected by whether or not they feel their compensation is fair. Hence, excessive executive pay that workers see as unfair decreases their productivity and makes them less committed. An employee's productivity is further lowered if their pay is low enough that they are struggling to afford basic expenses. This happens because people living in scarcity devote a significant portion of their mental energy to these stresses, which they might be otherwise using to work. So you know that stupid right-wing talking point that poverty is a motivator for hard work and success? Yeah, that's a lie.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
Big Stinker asserts that he arrives at his conclusions in the same manner that societies progress, through a kind of neutral, fair-minded, rational investigation of the facts as they unfold. But the post-war rise of critical theory threw a wrench in the works of such illusions.
Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer decried the notion of reason as some disinterested historical force, claiming that logic, rationality, scientific method, and other gifts of the Enlightenment were often marshaled towards nefarious ends under the guise of ambivalence and the lie of inevitability.
Colonialism, genocide, scientific racism, environmental devastation, economic shock therapy were all justified using science and reason. Power structures couldn't have asked for a better tool. Speaking of tools, Pinker enthusiastically reproduces this Western intellectual tradition of scientism. Enlightenment Now liberally appropriates the language and prestige of reason in order to legitimize a selective, one-dimensional comic book narrative of
progress.
One sure to get him invites to all the fanciest parties. But in order to make it all fit into a neat little package, he ends up tying himself up in knots trying to dance around the many contradictions he forces upon himself. Take, for example, his untidy amalgamation of Enlightenment thinkers into a single set of coherent values.
Of the many things Pinker is doing in Enlightenment Now, one is giving an intellectual history of the Enlightenment period. The purpose of his doing this is to bolster his own worldview by identifying it with some of the most beloved figures in the Western canon. So let's look at Pinker's intellectual history to see how accurate it really is. This is how Pinker defines the Enlightenment in his book. The Enlightenment is conventionally placed in the last two-thirds of the 18th century, though it flowed out of the scientific revolution and the Age of Reason in the 17th century and spilled into the heyday of classical liberalism in the first half of the 19th. The era was a cornucopia of ideas, some of them contradictory, but four themes tie them together: reason, science, humanism, and progress. What Pinker doesn't state explicitly is that in talking about the ideas that characterize the Enlightenment, he isn't talking about the ideas held by the majority of the people from that era, but rather the ideas held by famous philosophers from that era. Otherwise, his thesis would be too stupid even for someone like Pinker to believe. So let's take a look at those famous philosophers and see if they match Pinker's definition. Let's start with Immanuel Kant, the author of the essay, What is Enlightenment?, which Pinker cites in the book. Kant was certainly an advocate for reason, but he thought that we need to critique it and rein it in because it has an innate tendency to overreach its bounds and produce illusions. Kant was also certainly no humanist. He saw no value in human happiness except insofar as it is granted by God as a reward for living morally. So how about David Hume then? Hume didn't think reason was capable of providing humans with a basis for action. He thought that the foundations of ethics and science came from our instincts, to which reason is a mere slave, to use Hume's word. What about Spinoza then? Spinoza was no humanist because he didn't see human beings as essentially distinct from the universe as a whole. And Spinoza thought that good and evil were merely relative concepts, so the idea of there being progress in any objective sense was wholly alien to Spinoza. Then, of course, Locke made God the basis of his political philosophy, Descartes made God the basis of his epistemology, and so on and so on. Even Voltaire believed that the will was only explainable on the basis of God. Pinker goes to extreme lengths of sophistry to preserve his definition of the Enlightenment. Take the case of Rousseau. Rousseau rejects reason, science, humanism, and progress quite explicitly in his second discourse on inequality. So how does Pinker get out of that one? Well, he simply defines Rousseau as a romantic thinker, even though Rousseau was writing in the period that Pinker defines as the Enlightenment. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's not necessary that every Enlightenment thinker advocate for reason, science, humanism, and progress all at once. Pinker is providing a loose model of an Enlightenment thinker that the various thinkers approach to differing degrees. But that presupposes that Pinker's 4 criteria are even an interesting or illuminating way of thinking about the Enlightenment. If you actually read these thinkers and attend to the questions that they're grappling with, questions like the nature of substance, the conditions of knowledge, the limits of property rights, the possibility of immortality, and so on, you see that Pinker's definition of the Enlightenment isn't so much wrong as completely missing the point. In fact, the only thinker for whom reason, science, humanism, and progress are of central concern is Karl Marx. Marx thought that through reason, human beings could come to understand both the natural world and the social world. And unlike Kant, Hume, Locke, and Descartes, he didn't think God needed to intervene to make this possible. This meant that Marx had a strong commitment to science. Throughout his writings, Marx draws on physics, biology, history, and economics to make his arguments. This is why Marx identified himself as a materialist. He thought that what was most real about the world was that which is revealed to us by the empirical sciences. Also, if anyone qualifies as a humanist, then Marx does. Marx believed that humans have an unlimited capacity to transform nature and society to better suit their needs. Furthermore, Marx didn't think that humanity needed to subject itself to any standard given by God or nature. Marx thought that humanity could produce its own standards directly out of itself and then strive to realize them. This, of course, committed Marx to a belief in progress. Marx saw history as a gradual struggle for humanity to liberate itself, first from nature and then from tyranny. He thought that this progress towards freedom would continue into the future so long as we stuck to our reason, our science, and our humanism. So how does Pinker characterize Marx? Here's one quote from Enlightenment Now. Karl Marx possessed no wealth and commanded no army, but the ideas he scribbled in the reading room of the British Museum shaped the course of the 20th century and beyond, wrenching the lives of billions. Now, just in case you think Pinker is using scribbled and wrenching in a neutral sense, here's one more quote. Countries could deal with terrorism by deploying their greatest advantage, knowledge and analysis. Ideologies that justify violence against innocents, such as militant religions, nationalism, and Marxism, can be countered with better systems of value and belief. So just when Pinker gets his golden opportunity to identify a thinker that perfectly fits his model, he runs in the opposite direction. And why? Well, that should be obvious to everyone at this point. Pinker is not doing scholarship in Enlightenment Now. He is doing propaganda, specifically the kind of propaganda that will get Bill Gates to call you his favorite author, or that will get the Koch brothers to invite you to conduct lectures at their think tank. Pinker's wife is a philosophy professor. All he had to do was roll over in bed one night and ask her if Hume was a champion of reason, or if Rousseau wrote during the Romantic period. Perhaps he did. Either way, it wouldn't matter, because Pinker isn't out to educate his reader. He's out to deceive his reader, and, unfortunately, he's proven to be extremely good at doing that.
Well, gee whiz, thanks the Normie Times. That one had a real surprise twist at the end. Turns out Pinker is a repressed Marxist all along. Did not see that coming. But as I've shown several times in this video, this is but one of the ways Pinker has massaged both history and data to paint a picture convenient to established interests at a time of great uncertainty. The global hegemony of the Western ruling class is now facing existential threats from far-right populism, waning capital markets, climate change, ecological collapse, and a new world order rising in the East. Above all, Pinker has tasked himself with curing this declining faith in liberal capitalist democracy by prescribing a dose of reasonability. But crucially, it is Pinker himself that gets to define what counts as knowledge, critical thinking, and philosophy.
It is precisely that self-confidence, that self-consciousness, that audacity to think oneself the agent of history that enables a thinker to believe his particular thinking is thinking in universal terms, and his philosophy, philosophy. There is thus a direct and unmediated structural link between an empire or an imperial frame of reference and the presumed universality of a thinker thinking in the bosom of that empire.
So as much as we can accurately call him a stupid idiot, he is best understood as an entirely predictable invention of the very systems of control and repression that he defends. The arbiter of what is and isn't, Pinker's role is to push back against the tsunami of professors, intellectuals, economists, and academics who poo-poo the official fairy tale. Detractors are waved off as ideologues, politically correct scolds, or they are simply failing to see the beautiful reality past the dumpster fire of salacious current events that plaster the headlines and social media. Heavy news watchers can become miscalibrated. He's their dancing monkey, the self-appointed hype man of the status quo.
Well done, Stephen. You're a good boy.
On a side note, to his credit, the book isn't all wrong. Pinker offers up many other uncontroversial indicators of progress. Education, literacy, working conditions, violent crime, democracy, human rights, hunger, IQ scores, child mortality, vaccines, and a host of other factors have all improved leaps and bounds in the last 2 centuries across the globe. But to the degree that these can all be verified, you can easily make the case that all these achievements happened in spite of capitalism, not because of it. What we think of as progress and society's greatest achievements are rooted in things like public education, social activism, publicly funded research, and organized class struggle. Not because Steve Jobs or Elon Musk innovated some disruptive synergies. And while the Bonos and Bill Gates of the world have been working tirelessly to solve global poverty within the capitalist framework, the 54 years since the US declared war on poverty have amounted to little more than a fart in the wind. Anybody remember Campaign 2000? How'd that work out for you? Pinker's liberal technocratic progress, echoed in the platforms of Andrew Yang and Elizabeth Warren, is doomed to fail. Partly because its rational sterility and tyranny of metrics subordinate the human experience to the system, but more importantly because it fails to challenge its own inner logic and see beyond the boundaries of capitalist realism. The technocratic model assumes there exists a single rational solution for every policy challenge. But democracy is not an engineering project. Poverty's stubborn persistence will forever remain a thorn in the side of liberal do-gooders until we finally let go of everything that's rotten and move on to the next chapter in our story. Socialism. So yes, in many ways we have made real progress. Not that anybody ever said we hadn't. But frankly, given the awesome Enlightenment gifts of reason, science, and humanism, what Pinker misses is that, by all rights, we should be doing a hell of a lot better. Something's jamming up the gears. A closer look reveals that our path out of the Enlightenment reads better as an account of our embarrassing mismanagement, negligence, and suppression of our awesome potential. So rather than patting ourselves on the back for where we are now, our political project going forward must be to cast aside the stale ideas and systems getting in the way of
progress.
Only then might we finally realize the Enlightenment's failed promise of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Please consider sharing this video with all your big brain, liberal, and centrist friends. This video was a year in the making. If you like this content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I don't make any money on my videos. They are all demonetized. Everything I earn is 100% through my Patreon. Patrons get early access to my videos, and we're going to do patrons only live streams on cool topics. I want to be able to do this full time, so please consider throwing me a couple bucks. If you really liked it, send me a few more bucks, but every little bit actually helps. I drew from over 50 sources for this video, so if you have any problems with anything I said, take it up with them. They're in the description. Surprisingly little of this video is my original analysis. Alright, it's time. Thumbs up if you like the video. Thumbs down if you get triggered when actual experts in their field destroy your comforting illusions with facts and logic. And that upsets you. I'm talking to you, Pinker. I know you're watching. And special thanks to all the great bread tubers who helped give voice to the various authors and contributed to the video. In no particular order, Theory Plead, Re-Education, Radical Reviewer, Douglas Lain of Zero Books, Gushin, Kelly Zahos, Jackie Fox, The Normie Times, Damon Garcia, Hakim, Cunhado de Izquierdas, and Ben Burgis of Zero Books. So check out their channels listed in the description and hit subscribe. Oh, and also make sure to check out the Rev Left Radio podcast. I borrowed a couple of their clips for this video. They produce awesome content. They also have a YouTube channel as well. And since this video took over a year to make, I'm going to go ahead and thank all of my patrons, past and present, starting with Ben Johnston, Benjamin Morrison, and Offerlos Valgarning, Jacob McCarthy, Jazz, JWoww, Callie, Lobster, Neo Florian, Noah, Ranger Jenny, Wes Franklin. Thank you, my dudes. Come 2020, I will be wiping that slate clean and only be thanking current patrons.